Now, I'd like to touch on what I've found has been a very helpful index of my spiritual state condition. There's two things that are important in your conscience. One is the question of guilt. And guilt, as you know, kicks in when you do something that's wrong. So guilt is when you sin. Now, anger, on the other hand, comes, amongst other things, not always the case, but is the obvious reaction to you being abused, sinned against by somebody else. Now, there are two basic dimensions, if you like, to our spiritual life with Christ. On the one hand, there's our relationship with Jesus and our faith in Jesus. Now, on the other hand, there's our relationship with other people. Now, Satan attacks us usually on one of two fronts, if you like. He gets us to sin against God. And once he sins, then he accuses. Once we sin, he accuses and he condemns us in order to destroy our faith or weaken our faith. So that's the number one target. If you're going to understand spiritual warfare, this is target number one. This is what I'd call the front door attack. But far more common, particularly within the church, is the back door attack. What happens is this. Satan gets somebody to sin against me. Fellow Christian, a Christian in authority, and there's one thing that we all feel angry about is if somebody in office who's a Christian abuses that office in order to damage us in some way. So somebody sins against us, we get angry, and then we retaliate in some way. Now, anger, if you like, is the normal response to being sinned against. Somebody sins against you, you're angry. And Satan uses that then to attack us by destroying our love for fellow Christians. That's the backdoor attack. And that by far is the most effective attack within the church. Working within church, whether you're going to be pastors or lay people working in the church, you'll find out that the greatest damage he does in the church is through this backdoor attack. He sabotages us. So either by getting us to sin and using our guilt against us, or he sabotages our love by getting somebody to sin against us and using our anger then to destroy our love for fellow Christians. Let's have a look at a passage where Jesus touches on this, which is rather surprising, and it comes right at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. It's obviously rather important as far as Jesus is concerned. Now, as we go through this, watch out for what's unexpected here in the teaching of Jesus. Julie, I think you're next. Ben, you read, Nathan read. Okay, Julie. Matthew chapter 5, verse 21 through to 26 is what I want to look at closely.
You have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court." But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, "You good for nothing," shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, "You fool," shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent.
Jesus, rather here surprisingly, seems to imply that anger is murder. And that makes all of us murderers. Just come on. Remember, he says, he starts at the beginning, you've heard it said, old time, 10 commandments, you shall not kill. He says, well, if you're angry with your brother, then you're subject to judgment. Now, brother here in Matthew's Gospel always means fellow Christian. So it's talking about what's happening in the church. And can any of you pick the escalation here? It begins, first of all, by feeling angry. Then what does it lead to? What's the next stage? A term of contempt. Raka is an abusive term, putting people down. I could think some choice Australian expressions, which I won't use, but it is a really demeaning put down, verbal put down. And the last one is not so transparent for us. If anyone says, you fool, do you know what Jesus is getting at there? The term fool meant much more theologically for Jews at Jesus' time than it does for us. Usually it's just, you're an idiot. Fool. Do you know what the term fool was for? Used by people who were the rabbis?
Like a non-believer sort of, that doesn't really right as well.
That's right. That is right, yes. It's the term. Remember that Psalm says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool was a term that was used by the rabbis for a person who was an unbeliever or an atheist or non-Christian. So, what's the escalation? Can you see the progression? First of all, you feel anger. Then what happens? What weapon do you use to pay? You use your tongue to lash out at somebody and hurt them, abuse them. And what's the last stage?
You take their faith or their belief.
I think it's a bit more precise than that, but you're getting on the right track. If you call somebody a fool, you are damning them. You say, in Australian terms, damn you. You are condemning them, damning them. Right? So, first of all, you're angry, then you pay back verbally, you express verbally, and then you use your anger to discount them, to reject them as a fellow believer, as a brother and sister in Christ. You damn them with your statement of them. Yes, Maria?
So the first stage, anger, is that a sin?
Well, we're going to come to that because let's deal with it. Is anger always sin?
No, it can't be.
No, God's angry. It's not the anger is neutral. It's like any emotion. It's neither good nor bad. It just is. Notice that Jesus says, not that if you're angry, but you're angry what? I tell you that anyone who's angry with his brother, that's angry against. It's targeted anger. And it's not angry. It's interesting, the Greek there is that aggressive side. Now, if you hurt me, I'm going to be angry. I'm going to be hurt. I'm going to be angry. The sin comes into it with what I do with my anger. Now, there's a very fine line there, and I'm going to come back to it, Maria. If I can just let it pend, if you don't mind.
No, that's good.
And now, then there's a second escalation. If you're angry against your brother, then what level of judgment will you face? Okay, it's the local court of law. If you abuse somebody verbally, then you go to the Sanhedrin. Which is that? The Sanhedrin in Jesus' day was the Jewish Supreme Court. Remember, they're the people that put Jesus to death. So local court, supreme human court. But if you damn somebody, then what? Then you damn yourself. Notice that escalation there. Watch out. Anger leads to judgment. And anger in which you damn somebody leads to consigning yourself to hell. If you think in terms of what happens, you sin against me, I feel angry against you, and I reject you as a brother. How do I get back at you? I'm a good Australian. I don't smash you in the face, but I use the most effective weapon of all, which is my tongue, against you. And what?
Do it behind your back.
Well, you can do it. No, this is here face-to-face stuff. It's in your face stuff, and you put a person down. But the most strongest form of verbal expression is if you in your anger, you damn somebody. Okay, then the second part. Do any of you see what is funny about the next part? Just read that again, verse 22 to 24, please, Julie.
But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, "You good for nothing," shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, "You fool," shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering.
Now, just think this through. Jesus is talking about the danger of anger. What do you think Jesus would say then? Okay, you're going to church, you're going to bring your offering to God. Then what would you expect Jesus to touch on? Yes?
Remember, you're angry at someone.
Yeah, if you remember that you're angry because somebody has wronged you, but notice it's the other way around. What is it? That your brother is or sister is angry with you. So it's not so much if you're angry, deal with the anger, but when you go to church and you remember what? Somebody else is angry with you. Then what? Go and settle with that person first and then come and offer your gift. Why? That person's anger sabotages your worship of God. Now, why do you think Jesus goes that way? So it's not so much my anger that he deals with, but the anger of my brother.
It may be even common sense, because the
Yep.
person who's angry is angry, and if you go and reconcile to that person,
Yes.
then you actually rescue them in many respects.
That's right.
Even though they're really angry at you.
That's right. Right? So, and that's a very common sense thing. But I think there's another dimension.
To do with subordination in the sense that God's willing to offer you his peace and his forgiveness, but he also is aware that he's commissioned someone to over you as well, and that person also needs to forgive you. Like God is a designated part of God's forgiveness.
Yes.
This person.
Yes.
Important that you receive as well.
It's definitely that. Yep.
Because
And there's another common sense thing.
their anger hinders their worship of God.
Their anger destroys their worship of God. Yes, all that. Are you always aware when you're angry? I'm never angry. Are you? I'm angry sometimes when I lose my block, but what surprises me that I've done my block. I wonder where it comes from. What are you most aware of? Your own anger or other people's anger? Okay, you know that. Okay? And so the index is not am I angry, but is somebody angry against me?
Which implies that you've done something wrong.
That's right. So I've done something wrong. They're angry with me. Therefore, I take the initiative. Now, that's not the way it is in the world, because in the world it goes the other way around. If I do something wrong, then that person should take the initiative to be reconciled to me. That's the power game we play. And then lastly, Jesus says, uses a parable then of being taken to court. Who is the adversary here? Julie, can you read 25 to 26?
Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out there until you have paid up the last cent.
Common sense. If somebody's taking you to court, you've got a window of opportunity. You can settle the matter out of court. So if somebody's angry with you, you can go and say, what's the matter, Hans? Why are you angry with me? What have I done wrong? And you can sort it out, okay, and then there's no court case that settles. It's settled. And it's the same too with us. We are to settle before we go into court. The court is the final judgment of God to escape that damnation. But notice most significantly, Jesus' switch. He says the important thing that you need to keep track of, okay, note your own anger, but most importantly, keep track of whether people are angry with you and check out the realities. Anger is murder of a brother. You get hostility, which leads then to judgment in local court, verbal insult to the Supreme Court, and verbal condemnation to the fire of hell. Notice that Jesus puts the onus not on the person who's offended, but the offender to go and confront the angry person and to settle outside of court. Now, in our Christian tradition, already from as early as the Didache, written about 90 AD, this was understood as a reference to Holy Communion. If you come and bring your gift in Holy Communion and remember that your brother's angry with you, therefore what? Go and settle with your brother, sister before you go to communion. And this is why in the early church you had the sharing of the peace before communion as evidence that people were reconciled with each other. The onus then for settlement is on the offender. Now, all of this is fairly straightforward, at least at this level. Satan uses guilt to undermine your faith. And you're aware of this, and there's a lot of Lutheran teaching on this side of the equation in terms of confession and absolution. Okay? If you sin against somebody else, Satan accuses you, and then he will use your offence to condemn you. And in this way, he'll try and undermine your faith, and he'll undermine your spiritual life. Now, the whole of Lutheran teaching on justification deals with this side. Maria?
Say if there was a case, maybe where,
Sorry, what?
Say if there was a case maybe where a person goes to reconcile, but the person doesn't want to reconcile.
Yep.
Have you done attempted and then you go to the altar, or do you
Yes.
keep going until you reconcile?
Number one, what's important is that you make the effort, the attempt. There's no magic solution here saying that if you go and confront a person who's angry with you, whom you've offended, that person will respond positively. There's no magic solution to that. The onus lies on you to try and settle with that person, if possible, at least on your side of the issue. I want to deal with some quite a bit picky next lesson on dealing with anger, now which is the other side of it. But that's this side. Coming out of this then, you have three practices which are very common in our Lutheran tradition. Number one is to use the 10 Commandments to examine ourselves. And you can use the 10 Commandments to examine yourself in two ways. I don't know whether you realise. I use the 10 Commandments to find out when I've sinned against others, but I also use the 10 Commandments to find out, to identify when others sin against me, the things that make me angry. Have I been abused by a person in authority? Fourth commandment. Am I abused sexually, or whatever the case may be? Did somebody borne false witness against me? So on. So use the 10 Commandments, both to identify your guilt, but also your anger. When it comes to dealing with guilt, we have two ready, easy ways of dealing with it. There's communal confession and absolution, which we have at the beginning of every service. You're familiar with that, aren't you? I don't need to go into that. So confession, absolution, but then also private confession and absolution. One of the great things that's happened in my own lifetime within the Lutheran Church here in Australia is the revival of private confession and absolution, not just in the church but also here in our seminary community. It's a very, very wonderful gift, and it's a way of dealing with guilt. Yes, Maria, you had your hand up? You did. Oh, you just had your waving. Now, Satan doesn't just use our guilt to destroy our faith, but he uses anger to destroy our love. If the ultimate point that he wants to bring us to is, okay, somebody sins against me, I feel angry. He wants to turn my anger into hatred. Okay, let's have a look at the reverse side of that then in 1 John chapter 3, 11 to 15, which is very, very important for our spiritual lives. 1 John chapter 3, 11 to 15. Vaughan, I think it's your turn.
But this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was of the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, brethren, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him.
What's the simplest sign, evidence that you are saved, that you have eternal life?
That we love one another.
And that's very difficult because love, we identify love with feeling. In most cases, I don't feel anything towards my fellow Christians. So if I say, do I love you? I can't say it in the same way as I love my children or love my wife. John turns it around and puts it another way of looking at it. Turn it around, okay? What's a sign that I have eternal life? Well, no murderer has eternal life abiding in him or her. If you're a murderer, what you? You hate your brother and sister. So the absence of hate, if I can put it that way, is a sign that we have eternal life. The presence of hatred is a sign that something is wrong. We forfeited the life we have. So hatred is the thing to watch. Hatred which leads to rejecting our fellow Christians. And notice that John defines love here not so much in terms of feeling, but in terms of what we do. Just reread, Vaughan, verse 16 and 17.
We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him?
Love of God means that you don't close your heart to brothers, sisters, people in need. Anger, hatred belong together, and hatred leads to the destruction of our life as Christians. We share in the life of Jesus. That life is destroyed in one or two ways. Satan destroys it by destroying our faith or by destroying our love for one another. Faith then he wants to destroy to unbelief. Love he wants to turn into hatred. And it's easy how it's amazing how quickly anger turns to hatred. Now, how does it happen? Let's say somebody close to me does something wrong. What Satan does is accuses them to me. So if somebody has done something wrong to me, I dwell on the injury, and I don't know if you're like me, but then I replay the injury. It's like a film loop, and every time I play it, what happens? What? You add a bit, it gets worse, and I get madder on the one hand, and the madder I get, the more vengeful I get. And there's another thing too, I go on and I assume the moral high ground. I become more and more self-righteous, and I feel more justified in being angry. So I feel self-righteous, I take the moral high ground, I go into the judge's seat, and I finally, and the more that escalates, the more I replay that loop, the worse it gets. And then I don't just replay that loop, but I go back and I remember every other loop. And so it turns out when that person just did something wrong with me, eventually I reach that point where that person, there's nothing good in that person. That person's totally evil. And if that person's totally evil, then what am I justified in doing? Condemning them, writing them off. And killing them off, not out there, but where do I kill them off? Inside here. Now, you've all been there. That's very common human ground. And it's the most dangerous place possible to be spiritually. That's far worse than being stuck in your guilt, is being stuck in that escalating situation of anger. Now, yes?
Could you just comment on, for people who have been sinned against in quite a terrible way,
Yes.
the praying the Lord's Prayer can be very difficult for them.
Yes. Forgive us our trespasses as we hereby forgive those who have trespassed against or sinned against us.
Could you comment on...
I'll be dealing with that later on, and dealing with anger. Now, I don't know whether you recognise, it's far easier for us to deal with guilt for the sins we've committed. I put to you that the greatest damage that's done in the church is not from the sins we commit, but the sins that are committed against us. I've noted in the years that I've been a pastor that, and this is increasing, that for every one person that comes to me for private confession and absolution for something they've done, be something like 5 to 10 come to me for something that's been done to them. They've been abused in some way. Now, that's been brought right out into the open by the whole question of sexual abuse. But that's only a tip of the iceberg. Initially it was abuse of women, but what's one of the frightening statistics now is how many male guys are abused. It's not just one side of women. It's still not as many as women, but we have this, all of a sudden, that's come out into the open. But the whole question of abuse, and the church has had to deal with it in the safe place kind of stuff, that's a problem. But that merely deals with the surface of things. How do you help a person who has been injured? How do you help a person who's been sinned against? And not just superficially, but deeply. Can you deal with it spiritually? How do you get Satan out of this stuff? Yes?
It's like what that pastor from Canada came and talked to us about.
Restorative justice, yes. Yes.
That's a part of it.
That's one, and a very important part of it. And that's more the external side, but I want to deal with the spiritual side of this, okay? Somebody else? Okay, yes.
I think probably it doesn't rest on the wisdom of people in this
No.
sense. I think we need to bring the appropriate word of God.
Okay, and that's what I want to talk about now. Well, it depends. But won't get now. Now, just one final thing, and I want to just do a little bit more reflection on anger and the way it works. First of all, remember that one of the Beatitudes of Jesus is, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons, daughters of God." We're called to be peacemakers, And that's to live at peace as far as possible with all people. That's what I want to talk about. Now, I just want to have a look at anger. Now, anger in itself is not good or evil. In fact, anger like guilt is good. If you just let me take guilt. In what way is guilt good?
It shows us what we see.
Okay, it shows us that we've done something wrong. If you got rid of guilt, then what would you get rid of? Conscience. And by getting rid of conscience, you'd get rid of what? You'd get not sin. Sin would still be there, but awareness of sin. So it would be, if you got rid of guilt, you'd get rid of all moral sensitivity. There are some people who don't feel guilt. Do you know who they are? Sociopaths. Okay? And they are the most insensitive. They're basically dehumanized human beings. So guilt in itself is good because it's an index that we've done something wrong. In what way is anger good?
It can be angry at sin.
Anger, it's sin. It's that something is wrong, not that we've done something wrong, but that something has been done wrong somebody else, or something has been done wrong to us. If somebody did something wrong to you and you... Can you see what the problem would be? If you didn't have any capacity to be angry, okay, if I could wave a magic wand and remove the possibility of anger from you, what would I be removing together with the removal of anger? The emotion anger. If I could have an operation cutting up the angry part, what would I turn you into? An emotional zombie. Emotional sensitivity, emotional intelligence is connected with anger. By getting rid of anger, you also get rid of love and all the other emotional side of us. Anger in itself is good. God is angry. What's God angry with? Sin, injustice, abuse. What kind of God would we have if, this baby is killed? This woman's raped. This guy is murdered. And God says, oh, well, that's very interesting. What am I going to do about it? If God's God, what does God have to do? He's got to be angry. God's anger is good anger. It's righteous anger. And God is not an emotional zombie. He reacts emotionally and is involved emotionally with us. That's a very, very important part of our Christian life. It's an aspect of his love. So anger in itself is neither good nor bad in itself. Positive, it's an index that we've been hurt, or generally out there, it's an index that something is wrong. We shouldn't. If you read the newspaper, you've got to be angry. Because look at all the things that are going wrong. Now, the problem, the negative side to anger is not anger in itself, but what we do with it. It's the source of bitterness, hatred, vengeance, a whole box of things. So Paul says that anger in the negative sense is one of the works of the flesh, even though in itself it is good. Now, Satan uses what's good, like guilt or anger, against us. He uses these passions, these emotions that we have, and uses them against us to attack us and destroy us. Notice the warning that we have about anger in James chapter 1. I think, Josh, you're next. James 1, 19 to 20.
Know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God.
The anger of man doesn't produce the righteousness of God. God can use anger in such a way that nothing negative comes from it, but because we, being what we are, anger is a very dangerous instrument, as you probably learned. The anger of men doesn't produce the righteousness of God. And so James says, be quick to listen, be slow to speak, because the danger is that when you speak, you express anger and you use anger inappropriately. Maria?
Ephesians 4:26 says, in your anger do not...
I'm going to look closely at that one. That's a very important passage. Yes. Yes, you're jumping ahead, but that's good. Now, I just want to do a little bit of an anatomy of anger. Most of you I've picked are pretty good at anger. And I've noted that here there's basically two ways in which you and I, people like us, deal with anger. There is some of us extrovert, others of us introvert. And some of us do it both ways. One day it's this way, one day it's that way. Okay? Something goes wrong. Somebody does the dirt on you. How do you react? Okay? If you're an extrovert, basically you turn it outwards. You got to tell somebody else about it. You express your anger in some way, and it leads to then raging against what's happened, losing your temper, finding a scapegoat, projecting your anger onto somebody outside, and then it turns out, and you use either the tongue or your hand to take vengeance. And so anger leads to bitterness, leads to hatred, leads to external revenge. So losing your temper on somebody. And the way it usually happens within our community, it's using this instrument, extroversion. Although out there in the general community, it doesn't change. It's not just verbal abuse, it's leading to physical abuse. Angry. The Barry Hall kind of reaction. He's your classical instance of this kind of guy. Now within the church, however, the opposite is more common, is that people turn it inwards. You turn your anger inwards, and you then brood over your hurt. You go into that loop. It goes over and over and over again, and then you actually nurse your resentment. It's a funny thing, you delight in it. You enjoy it. Why? Because it makes you feel good, and it makes you feel right, and it makes you feel that the other person's wrong. It gives you the moral high ground against somebody, but you bottle it up. And the danger is that you bottle it up to some extent eventually, that the only way of coping with it, unless it's going to explode outwards, is that you've got to switch off anger, the emotion inside. And you know what happens when you switch off that angry feeling inside you?
If you can.
If you can, because what you have to switch off with switching off the anger, you've got to switch off all your emotions. Do you realise that we are in a society where a lot of people are basically emotionally desensitized, switched off because of that turning inwards? And that's a very dangerous place. What happens? Anger leads to self-pity, poor me, victim, and that feeds depression. Now, notice it doesn't cause depression. Depression's caused by all sorts of things, but it feeds depression. And depression very often feeds on self-pity. And it leads then to you taking, instead of punishing out there, what happens? You punish yourself. And one of the most obvious cases of that with young people these days is the self-harming kind of stuff. Now, why do young women, men, self-harm? They can't feel anything. They've got to switch off. And so much so that they are not feeling anything. The only time you feel something is when you actually hurt yourself. At least what's the good thing about that? At least I feel something. Otherwise I feel dead, emotionally dead. Now, these are the two natural ways of dealing with anger, turning it in, turning it out. What I'd like you to do in preparation for Wednesday's lesson is just to analyse yourself. I'm not going to ask you, but to analyse yourself. How do you deal with the hurts you've suffered? What's your customary mode of dealing with it? Where's your pathology here? Now, which of these two do you tend to go? Where does the danger in this lie for you?